Welcome to Self-Funded. I'm your host, Chrissie Francona. 10 years ago, starting a business around yourself was something reserved for celebrities. Today, professionals everywhere are breaking away from the 9-to-5 and building businesses around their own experience and expertise. On this show, we'll explore what it really means to be self-funded, the movement of professionals carving their own path, creating cash-flowing businesses, and building lasting impact without waiting for permission. I'll share my own journey and talk with others who are rethinking what's possible when you take your career into your own hands. Let's dive in. Today on the podcast, I have Packy McCormick, the founder of Not Boring, a media company and venture fund. Packy invests in companies that are decidedly not self-funded, but I wanted to interview him about his own experience because he's built a really interesting ecosystem or flywheel around his deep curiosity and insights in the cutting edge of technology. We talk about how he got started and what he'd do if he was starting today, and where he sees the self-funded world going. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Packy McCormick, welcome to Self-Funded.
Thanks for having me, Chrissie.
So for those who are not familiar, what is Not Boring?
It's a great question that I struggle to answer.
You're still figuring it out.
I'm still figuring it out. Essentially, Not Boring is a newsletter and now a fund kind of writing about and investing in technology companies.
One of the things that I have found really interesting about your journey as a fellow Duke grad, you followed a pretty standard post-Duke path, investment banking, then into tech startups in New York, and then suddenly you're writing a newsletter. What did that transition look like? And did you feel pressure to stay on a normal path, or how did you handle that?
Yeah, I think, so I started at Bank of America Merrill Lynch and was doing that for a little while. And I think there were a couple of things. One, I really liked it. Like I liked the people I worked with. I actually enjoyed it. I liked working hard. I think like a young kind of person in finance.
Were you in technology? Were you in the technology group? No. Okay.
No, not at all. The tech has always kind of been a side interest that I was able to make the real interest. Like at Duke, I definitely did kind of startup competitions and all of that. And now, I mean, I've wanted to be a founder for a while, and that'll pop up a couple of times. And now seeing what good founders look like, it's like almost absurd that I wanted to be a founder. And so I'm glad that the path kind of took me this way. But I think a few things. One, like looked at my MD and realized that like certainly that wasn't, if I worked really hard for 20 years, where I wanted to be. And then two, looked at my friends who were really who loved finance and were really good at it. And I just realized one, they're smarter than me, but two, just I wouldn't be able to compete with someone who was just as obsessed as they were with it. So left, I was going to go to business school, ended up joining this startup. I'd actually quit first, just pretty much to interview. And I think there's something important there in burning the boats. I think whenever I've tried to do two things kind of at once, you can never go kind of all in. So burned the boats on that, worked at the startup breather for 6 years, kind of near the very end. We'd brought in a professional management team. It was a lot less interesting, and I disagreed with kind of where the company was going. So tried to quit a few times and finally did. And so kind of burned the boats again. I was going to start a company then, and COVID hit. And so that fell through, and had no choice but to kind of go all in for a little bit on this newsletter that I'd been writing at the time. So none of it felt too risky. I think I'm a very risk tolerant or even risk kind of seeking person. But certainly I think it was helpful both times that I had quit before making the transition and just went all in on doing the thing.
Yeah. And so when you started the newsletter, were you starting it for you as a reader of newsletters and you were seeing something that didn't exist, or were you looking at the newsletter ecosystem and saying there's an opportunity? Why newsletter? How did that start?
I was honestly bored at work. And I've told this story before, but I was sitting in a board meeting or an exec meeting one day with our team, and we were talking kind of in context about showing the company a bunch of slides with numbers. Mm-hmm. And I said the word enumerate. And everybody in the room looked at me like I had 7 heads and I had just made up some word. And I was like, if I keep working with these people and not doing anything else, my brain is just going to shrivel and die. And so at the same time, I think I was on Twitter then. I think I probably had 200 or 300 followers, but I saw a tweet from David Perel about this new writing course that he was starting called Rite of Passage. And so I just on a whim signed up for that. And so as part of that program, one of the things that we had to do was set up a Substack newsletter. So like there was no thought or intention behind it. The first kind of version that I did was just, here's 3 things that I've read or found interesting this week. It was like really just a check the box on the assignment. But I took it seriously, and I think there's probably something important there too, which is like even small ridiculous things where it's like 20 people, mostly family members, reading this newsletter. Like I was like, you know what, I said I'm writing every Sunday at the time, and so every Sunday, like I remember being on a train and like writing and trying to send this out, even though it was to nobody. I think the whole first year was 400 people. And it wasn't until later that once I had started kind of writing longer essays and had that experience trying to start the company and COVID hitting, that I was like, all right, well, I do see a hole in the market, which is Ben Thompson is the GOAT. He's like incredibly good at very serious kind of like tech strategy analysis, but he could never be unserious, and I can be like very unserious. And so like the beginning was really like take this like Disney thing and then combine it with like this economics thing and write an essay on that. And so that was the kind of like initial foothold into the market.
How did you come up with the name Not Boring?
That was the name of the company, the business I was going to start, like kind of Soho House for nerds, Not Boring Club. The genesis of that was like, I think both in finance and at Breather, like I worked all of the time in both of those jobs, and I had no kind of side hobbies or interests, and like had kind of realized that I had become boring. And so having this place where you could like go do a bunch of these other things, we started like a mini debate club to kind of prepare for it, and like it'd be a bunch of stuff like that in hindsight I would have been terrible to run, and like actually would have been a pretty bad business, I think. But the idea was like, can I, there's a lot of people who are working hard in the city, but like, would you be less boring if you did this, like all this other stuff with the people? Then when that shut down, I think my mom actually suggested just kind of, the email was called Per My Last Email for a little while. My mom suggested stealing the name and putting it on that.
That's funny. I mean, in some ways you have built a community, just it didn't look like what you thought it would.
Totally. This is a way more scalable way to do it.
As you think about your background, what experiences do you think have really led you to success with Not Boring?
I think there's definitely something to the combination of having worked in finance and having worked inside of a startup, although I do feel like that atrophies over time. Like, my knowledge of operating is not what it was 5 years ago when I started this, but I think that was certainly helpful. I always liked writing. I was not like a journalism major or an English major, but I always liked writing essays, I think more than most other things that we did in school. So that was there. And I think like that willingness, or like probably like even almost like a disease, but like willingness to work hard on things even that don't seem, particularly serious, like writing about the Mickey Mouse Club or whatever in the early days of Not Boring. I think that has been super helpful.
So you talked about starting out, you're sending it to 20 people every Sunday. I mean, certainly you weren't going to charge your mom for a subscription to Not Boring, but when did you start to think about building this into a business, and what was your initial concept of the business model?
Yeah. So for the first couple of years, it was just on, for the first, I guess it was actually probably 9 months. It was on the side while I was still at Breather, definitely not going paid. And then when I quit, fortunately, I guess in hindsight, because our lease had expired and it was COVID and we had just gotten pregnant with Dev, who is now 5 years old, we moved in with my in-laws during COVID. And so like had very few expenses. We did have like, healthcare and like that kind of stuff to figure out. But I think that was super useful because for the first 9 months, I didn't make a single dollar on Not Boring. And so I would tell my wife, like, we are at this point, like growing. And I was like, there's just math, like whether we do subscription or CPM, like if I get to a certain number of subscribers, then the revenue scales with that. And like, we should be fine. Trust me. And like, I will forever be grateful to her that she did trust me on that, because it sounds crazy in retrospect and I wouldn't recommend it now. But my plan had always been to go paid and start doing subscriptions. And then I think I realized at some point that I really liked the kind of growth of the audience and the paid might block that. And so decided to go the sponsorship model. And in the beginning played with a bunch of stuff. Like I used to do these sponsored deep dives where a company would pay me to write about the company. One of the first ones I did was Ramp, which ended up working out well. And I've written about them for free and invested in them many times since then. But mostly it's just like top of newsletter sponsorships. I'm actually thinking through it now. I think in particular, Substack is like really prioritizing paid newsletters. And so, whether it's vanity or actual growth, like not being on the top of leaderboards because I'm not paid is like kind of frustrating. And so like I think it's working, whatever they're doing, because now I'm thinking about, is there something that I could offer paid? Yeah,
it's funny when I just started Substack, and it's like really wants to push people towards paid. It's like, no, I actually just want to start this, and I have just friends signing up right now, and it's like, do you want to do the paid one? I'm like, I don't even want to offer the paid one right now, but it's still pushing me towards it.
There was a time too when they had, I forget what it was called, like pledges or commitments or something, where it would just like, it just started showing up that even if you didn't do paid, it just asked people how much they'd be willing to pay you, essentially. If you did, like, they really try to push that pretty aggressively.
Well, it's their business model. It makes sense.
Totally.
Looking back now on that early journey, what surprised you either positively or negatively about building a media business in this format?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think what surprised me maybe is like how little any growth hack that I tried to do mattered. Like I think like in retrospect, I think I was very naive. I was like, well, if I write about a topic like X, then I'll post about it, without any karma or whatever, like in the subreddit that's associated. And I'm sure a bunch of people will read it and subscribe. Or, my brother and I, like during COVID one day on the beach, like came up with a list of like 100 things that we could try to grow. And like practically none of them worked. And the only thing that really worked in growing it was if kind of in a non-coordinated, just totally random way, someone with a big audience who people trusted said, I read this thing and it was really great. And then you'd see a bunch of signups. I guess the one other thing that kind of worked was, particularly in the early days, if I wrote about a company, and particularly a company that had like a loyal and passionate group of employees, it would spread within that company. And so like that wouldn't make a dent now, but like I think, writing about Stripe, for example, got like 50 signups from people at Stripe, and like those types of things worked early. But I think like the importance of the quality of the content over growth hacky stuff, particularly doing it over time, was probably the biggest lesson for me.
Yeah. It sounds like, certainly the amount of effort and time you've put into all of your essays throughout the years. The depth of research and perspective is significant. And so it's almost like you've been able to build just on the credibility of, and the show and the consistency. It sounds like that's also been a huge part of it.
Totally. I think that's a big piece. And that brings up another good point too, where it's like, some writers are just like excellent writers, and I wouldn't put myself in that category, but I think like where I've had some essays fall outside of this, but like where I've had a lot of success on certain essays is just when I'm like really willing to put in a lot more research effort. And so like, I almost view my job as like, there's this topic that people are interested in. There's a ton of stuff like scattered across the internet and in people's heads about this topic. And if I just go out and spend like 100 hours getting that into a format that's like more readable, then that's something that people will value versus like, here's some like brilliant insight that I have off the top of my head, because those come very rarely.
Yeah. And I think the secret is where can you combine those two of like insight and then go deep on it. So,
yes.
Okay, so you mentioned at the front of this that Not Boring, started as a newsletter, but is now a fund as well. So in 2021, you announced Not Boring Capital and wrote, a year or two ago, a newsletter writer launching a venture fund as a solo GP would have been weird and newsworthy. What changed in those couple years that set you up to launch a VC fund on the back of the newsletter success?
Yeah, looking back, 2021 is a very weird time.
Yes.
And so like, I think anybody with an idea for anything that involved money, I think like probably could have launched in 2021. I think actually what's almost more interesting is what's happened since. Like there was a period where like anybody with any sort of audience could raise a venture fund. And a lot of that has shaken out. And so actually like one of the challenges now is, and I think hopefully like making it through the last, through the bear market and still taking the punches and doing this kind of gives me credibility, but certainly trying to raise in 2023, people were like, all right, you guys are done. Like this was a stupid thing. We should never invest in stuff like this. Like, glad to see you guys out of there. And I think hopefully the difference is like, there's such tight kind of coupling between what I invest in and what I write about that like everything I'm doing for the newsletter is in service of the fund in some way. And a lot of what I'm doing for the fund is in service of the newsletter and learning and sharing what I learn in those conversations. but like certainly there was probably an overabundance of kind of media first venture funds then, and now there's like a few that I think do. There's Harry Stebbings has 20VC, Patrick O'Shaughnessy has Positive Sum, and there's a few like very, very good ones out there. But I think a lot of the people who just were like, this seems like an easy way to get management fees for 10 years are gone.
I know. I think the thing though that a lot of those people overlooked was you're also signing up for 10 years of commitment.
Totally. I mean, you see the LP. I feel like I write like a separate newsletter every quarter, essentially for LPs, and there's 10 calls a day with portfolio companies and different things. So yeah, you're signing up for the long term. I realized, I think like even then I didn't know that I wanted to do this forever. Like I thought it was very interesting. I was like, I'm writing about these companies anyway. I was doing some SPVs, might as well invest. Like I think coming from having worked in a startup, it felt weird to just be outside kind of like writing and not being involved or putting any skin in the game. So I was like, yeah, we'll try a fund. And I've learned that I like really love this. And so, want to be doing this for a very long time, but it is a different job than I expected.
That's awesome. And I know you've written about this, but once you started the fund, you had already made some investments through syndicates over the previous, I think it was a year before. What was the first, and was that like, how did that, chicken and egg, like, did it start with, a company that you wrote about and they came to you and said, hey, do you want to invest? Or was it something you proactively just said, hey, well, I'm not putting money in?
Yeah. So this was actually a company that has now shut down called Apt, which my friend Fed had started. And we met each other while, he and his brother were building robots when I was at Breather. And I just like always have thought that they're incredibly smart and thoughtful people. And he reached out and said, I know you don't really write about companies startups very often, but a lot of what we're doing here is like based on this natively integrated company idea that you wrote about kind of before Not Boring was a thing. And so we'd love for you to like just write about what we're doing. And, we're also raising. And so if you guys want to invest, you can. We actually did that through a friend's syndicate because I didn't have anything set up and I didn't know yet. But that was really kind of the genesis. The first one that we did in an SPV was a company called Composer, which was started by my friend Ben Rollert, who I'd worked with at Breather. And that was something similar where he was launching, wanted me to write about it. And in that case, I'd back Ben to the ends of the earth. They just separately rolled out their kind of like AI trading product today. And like normally if I hear like an AI X thing, I just like turn off completely, and I understand like probably AI for trading is like even worse. But the way that they've like built this company over the past, like they've like rebuilt all the infrastructure. They have this like incredible back testing ability to create these like symphonies or strategies that automatically adjust for you. And like the way that they've implemented it is so good, where it just like helps you turn crazy ideas into this like structured symphony that will automatically trade. It's not saying like, we're going to beat the market or whatever. It's just like making this thing that was like limited to technical people, a little wider. Like they did that going from kind of like custom scripts to do this stuff to drag and drop to now this. All to say, like that one, I think we got lucky on, and it's like one of my favorite products. Definitely made some early mistakes as well too, though.
Yeah, I mean that's part of the process for sure.
Totally.
You alluded to this, but I want to dig in a little bit more to the flywheel between your research and writing and the investment arm. What does that look like? We talked a little bit about how that started really with early investments, but what does that look like today?
Yeah. So I think there's like kind of the very clear and explicit way that people understand, which is like, I can invest in a company and write about them and help explain what they do. And hopefully other founders see that and it comes back in the form of deal flow. And this works, I think, particularly well for more complex businesses, because I'm willing to go super deep on them. I think the less obvious thing is like just writing about so much stuff and spending so much time thinking about like kind of where the world is right now and like where it might be going in a little bit and what the right business models for all of that are, is that a lot of the value actually comes from having to put some sort of view on where the world is going on paper and defend it and like really think through it. And so, a lot of we ended up investing in a bunch of crypto, and that portfolio is doing well. And a lot of that came from just like being turned off by crypto to then like taking it seriously because I saw this like business model thing that, that might be relevant, to then spending a bunch of time kind of understanding the space. And because I was writing about it, I met a bunch of founders, and that kind of flywheel goes. The next one was, I think it was in 2022. we'd invested a bunch in crypto where there's like this shared infrastructure. We'd invested in Replit and a few others where it just seemed like building software was going to be easier to do. And so I wrote a piece about the good thing about hard things, and that ended up kind of manifesting as like we want to do more hard tech and these like what became kind of vertically integrated startups. And I think like without both the investing and the writing, that wouldn't have happened, and I probably wouldn't have gone as hard into that as I have. And I think that's been so far a really good decision. We'll see, these things take a long time to play out, but in terms of early performance and just how much I love working with this type of company, I think that helps, and then can refine that thesis. And a lot of the inbound that I get, or like the companies that we end up investing in, come from the founder read the newsletter, or like this thing that I wrote about particularly described like the way they were thinking about their business or something like that. And so those two kind of feed off of each other.
It's almost like you're putting your investment criteria on steroids out in the world. Like you'll look at a fund's website, and I feel like, especially maybe more on the PE side, sometimes I'll read like our focus. I'm like, I don't understand what they invest in. And
totally. And part of that is probably by design.
Yes.
But yes, for me, like it's the only advantage that I have. There's people who are smarter, who have more money, who have been doing this for longer and are more technical. And so like the only advantage that I have is being able to write and being able to kind of think through things in public. And I think like sometimes you can get things wrong. And so that, I think people probably worry too much about getting things wrong because nobody forgets or nobody remembers those ones, unless you're like really wrong and loud about it. But if you can like describe something in a way that like a founder has been thinking about a bunch and feels that like other people haven't kind of figured out yet, it I think forms like a pretty quick bond with that person in an interesting way.
One of the ways I sort of think about the writing side of what you're doing is you're essentially writing investment memos for a much larger audience. How has that influenced the investment side of Not Boring? And have you ever sort of gone down the path on a company, excited about it, and then ended up not investing because of the research that you did as part of your writing?
Totally. I normally cut it. Like I can't think of many examples of where I've published something and been really excited about something and then not invested. It's more when I start the process or start to have conversations with people, or I'll talk to a founder and I'll get like really excited by the first pitch, and then I'll start doing the research and digging in. And normally I'll back out and just say like, love this. I don't think like this is a good fit for what I'm trying to do. I think like one interesting category of this would be like humanoid robotics. And I had I'd met and written about actually Saman Farid at Formic, which they don't make the robots, but they do essentially like the implementation and rental and like helping actual warehouses use the robots. And I talked to a founder in the humanoid space, and I was like, this is the coolest thing ever. The world is designed for like all the talking points. The world is designed for humans. Labor is the biggest market in the world. Like this is a no-brainer. And then I luckily had spent time in the space, talked to Saman, texted him, and was like, what do you think? And he was like, I wouldn't do it quite yet. And so like after doing a bunch of research, and that wasn't the only research I did for it, backed out. And I think like that's maybe the as valuable a thing is like building up the network through this of people that I have spent time working with on pieces or gotten to know, being able to hit them up. But yeah, often I'll get like a week into kind of the light research process and just say like, this doesn't feel like one of the ones that we'd want to do.
What does your process look like from the perspective of like for every essay you're publishing, how many ideas do you start with, and do you go down the path? Like how much research are you putting into any one of them before saying like, yes, this is what the topic I'm going to publish on this week?
Yeah, I think it's gotten less, the funnel's gotten tighter. I would say like for a while I would look at, 10 things for everything that I would write about, particularly when I was doing these sponsored deep dives before. I think like there was definitely a point in the crazy market time where like there were 10 companies for every one that I wrote about, which I think was necessary, because if I just like, wrote about whoever was willing to pay me, it would have been bad. I think over time, like I've just gotten way better, and this is on the fund side and the writing side of kind of upfront, just being like, this is something that I think makes sense for what I'm doing, and this isn't. I think the downside of that is that you can miss some things that if I put in the research for a week, I might get really excited about, or certainly there are things like kind of outside the core focus area where I'll talk to a founder and be like, this is like incredibly cool and outside of what I would have expected, but really like it. And so I leave room for that, but the top of funnel is a lot tighter. Once I pick something to write about, I mean, it can be, I wrote this 40,000 word piece on the electric stack about a month ago now. And that was just like a month of like pretty much every day.
That's like writing a book, essentially, right?
It was essentially like writing. I mean, it's like a very short book, but with images and everything, I think it was 200 pages. So like not terribly short. I don't know what it would be in pure text. But that was just, there were days where I was like so into the research that I would just move meetings and try to like batch them later in the week to continue the writing process or the research process on that. And a lot of that was like, I thought it was going to take a week. And I typically start like reading as much as I can and then just started to write without an outline. And then kind of figuring out what the questions were. And when I was writing this one, I just kept running into questions where I didn't think I like understood something as well as I could. And so whether that's like reading another book or reading an article or ChatGPT deep research on this one in particular was super helpful, not in kind of framing the argument or writing any of it, but like just being like, all right, I have this idea. Can you explain like this thing? And it would go to the internet and find like a 1985 Japanese paper and translate it. And like, I would get a quote from that. And so for that, like where I'm just learning a bunch of stuff kind of grounds up a month, but I can do, if it's a company that I've worked with before, it'll take a couple of weeks, try to talk to as many people as I possibly can, read about whatever the developments are since I kind of last had gotten deep on them, and then just start writing and editing and all of that.
What does a week in your life look like? Because one of the things I think is really interesting is you're wearing multiple hats. And even we talked about, you're talking to LPs versus you're doing research versus you're writing versus, whatever else. You're recording yourself. Like, how do you think about context switching? And like, are you a time blocker? Like, how do you think about managing your flow and even like your creativity?
Yeah, I think this is one of the things that I'm still trying to figure out, and one of the things that I'm more set. For most of Not Boring, I was like, I'm going to write one piece every week. Sometimes maybe I'll miss, but I'm going to write one piece every week. In the beginning of this year, I'm like, I'm going to do fewer, deeper pieces. And if I'm just going to block my schedule. I'm going to try to batch meetings, and I'm just going to give myself like a lot of time to think. And I actually think that's too far in the other direction from a, ideal creative perspective. Because like there is something just about trying stuff that I think gets the juices flowing and makes better ideas come out. And so I'm still trying to find the happy medium between those two on the writing side. There is not a typical week, and I don't do a good job of like saying Tuesdays are my meeting days, or Monday is when I write. When I do send, I send on Tuesdays most of the time, and so I'll like try to keep Monday fairly open. But it's talking to a bunch of founders, whether potential or in the portfolio, certainly LP conversations, and then a lot of time just kind of like reading. And then once I have an idea, then I'll try to like block as much, in the electric slide case, move meetings out of the way to do the research and really go deep and write. But there's not like a planned calendar, and I don't know if it'd be better or worse if I tried to do that.
I mean, if it works for you, that's all that matters. So
far, it does feel like I'm hanging on where I'm like, I think I've written my last good piece. Like, it never feels like I'm like, I know what I'm doing. I'm in the flow and I'm just going to keep going. Like each time I'm like, I think I might be done.
But have you ever read Shoe Dog?
Yes.
Nike? Yeah. So that was actually what you just said. That was my most compelling takeaway from reading Shoe Dog, was basically how Phil Knight and Nike in general felt like they were on the precipice of failure almost until they went public. Like it was this hugely successful shoe brand. And I think at the time, I forget the numbers, but I think they were doing like even hundreds of millions of revenue. And this is going back 40, 50 years. And
that meant something.
Yeah. And it was just like one, especially like an inventory business. I mean, totally different than what you're doing, but just that I remember reading that book and just being so struck by, wait, this is a really successful business. How do you not feel like you've made it at this point, which was interesting.
Totally.
So,
which I think is, I mean, it's like probably unhealthy and also good. Like certainly I haven't made it by any stretch of the imagination. I think within the content business, especially, like you just have to keep doing it. Like you're not going to live off of your back catalog for very long. And so I think it's fun. I think it's also fun right now. There are just so many people doing it really well.
Yeah.
And so like it feels like the game has been elevated, which is really fun. So
cool.
Even if you are just as good and get your process, like someone will come in and do it better, and then you have to try to figure out how to compete.
For sure. One thing you mentioned, using ChatGPT as a research assistant in that piece you mentioned, you started Not Boring really before the rise of generative AI. How have, ChatGPT and other tools changed your process?
I've been very hopeful about how they would change my process a bunch of times. Like, I mean, obviously, like very early versions, I fed it a bunch of my essays and I was like, all right, write something like me. And it did such a bad job. Yeah. It was like a caricature, and like, we all know it's not a good writer, but I was like, all right, well, I'm still going to have to write, unfortunately, or fortunately. I'm kidding. I think that's an important part of the process. I don't know. Like I use it. It's like almost like a better search, honestly. Yeah. Like I use it. I'll start a project if I'm writing about a new topic and load whatever kind of like docs or information I have in there. And whenever I ask it to like give me like a compelling story out of that, or it just like doesn't actually do a very good job on that. And so it's more like, tell me all the quotes in these docs related to like X. So it's like a better search for that kind of stuff. I think as a safety blanket, like I do, whenever I'm stuck, feed it into Claude mostly and ask for feedback, but like the feedback sucks too, and I think it's all part of the same challenge, which is that it's like really good at average. And so like the things that I'll get will be like shaving off the edges that I think are the most interesting in the piece, or like focusing on just like very basic, like whatever writing advice it's read on the internet. And of course you can like try to create a different, like make a prompt that makes it more like a good editor and whatever, but it like kind of tries to smooth off the edges. Or if you do that and you say like, here's my editing rules, then it like adheres too closely to those. And so like if you want to have any like spontaneity or life in your writing, I think its feedback is pretty bad. And so it's like really as a very good kind of search engine, I think, for the most part.
Yeah, it's interesting because you're actually someone who certainly has a very large base of writing that you've done, and in theory could be a good source of basically training a model on what you've already done. But it's interesting. I agree with you on, like, I almost treat it as like an entry-level analyst or an intern. Like, I trust nothing and like totally ask for all your sources and all the process and trust nothing.
Yes. I think Ben Thompson kind of wrote about this a little bit. I think when Deep Research came out, that he was like, it's a very good research assistant. Like if I wanted a research assistant, it would be great. And I don't, because like so much of the process for me is like actually having to read the stuff or talk to people or do whatever else. And that really resonated. But like, I have to like bang my head against something for a very long time before I'm able to make sense of it. And anything that abstracts that process away, I think just makes the writing more shallow. And so, yeah, to have it like give you the sources, I think is really useful.
So shifting gears a little, in starting this podcast and defining this notion of being self-funded, of really building a business around yourself, I was excited to talk to you, one, because you've done it, but you've also written about it and you've sort of explored the future of whether it's the future of employment through different tools or the future of creation, as you've talked about. And so I want to go back to something that you wrote in 2021. You wrote about the great online game, which you described as an infinite video game that plays out constantly across the internet, where a typical path starts in a niche community where you go from consumer to creator over time, and there's exponential upside and compounding returns. So that was now 3.5, maybe 4 years ago, almost 4 years ago. What has continued to be true since you wrote that, and what has changed?
Yeah, that's the most interesting piece, like mentally for me, because it's certainly the most popular that I've written, and I think some of it holds up very well, and some of it I'm like, I actually like don't believe some of this anymore. And I think what's held up well is for the people who like really do a good job. The internet can be this like unbelievable amplifier. Like you can go find your people, you can like put out good work and like have it be appreciated by people who otherwise like you never would have met. You can find opportunity. Like all of that stuff is still true. And I think as with like a lot of other things, it's like gotten gamified to the point where it's like almost useless. And again, like really good quality work say that. I was talking to a founder the other day who he had invested in, who he was impressive in his own right and like had relevant background to what he was starting and all, but he like wrote one blog post that was so good that it got him on Invest Like the Best. And I've never seen the like one essay to Invest Like the Best pipeline, and then started a related company. And like one of the reasons that we invested certainly was because of like the depth of knowledge that he showed off there, and just like clear kind of skill and passion and understanding. It's been good for getting in front of potential customers who otherwise like would have been really hard to get in front of at such a young stage. So it was like, that is, I think, a prime example of it going really well. But like very clearly, he spent a ton of time and spent like 10 years of his career in that field to write that one piece. And then there's just, and luckily I think the X algorithm has gotten a little better recently at filtering some of this stuff. But like as soon as people saw other people doing well on the internet, it was like, all right, exactly what are they doing? We're going to go do that same thing, and try to get lucky. And I just like I think that's like, it's made the internet kind of grosser. So that piece I don't like. Although I did write in there that like that's not the way to do it. I think a misinterpretation of this could be like, just go tweet a bunch and like good things will happen. And I don't think it's like, do good work regardless of what the platform is, and then like use that to amplify it and get in front of the people in your niche.
Well, I think one thing that's interesting about what you're saying is oftentimes when you're looking at examples or inspiration, you're looking at someone's today versus the process that got them there. And with changing technologies and so forth, and I'll use a very random analogy. I remember being single 10 plus years ago, and I had friends who met on OkCupid, and I was like, well, I'll just go on OkCupid. And my friend was like, no one's on OkCupid anymore. They met 3 years ago on OkCupid. And so it's like, how do you find the OkCupid of 3 years ago to get, to get the result you're looking for? And so bringing it back to what you're doing, as technology has changed so much, like if you were to start Not Boring today, where would you start?
It is like, I wonder often if I could even start Not Boring today. Really, there's people doing some like really good stuff on kind of video and podcast. I'm like an old now, so I spend no time on TikTok. Like I don't know if you'd start Not Boring there. I think I'd actually probably start it in writing, and maybe start it a little bit differently, and just like actually go super like pick a few topics that I know really well, wait a while before putting anything out almost, and like just write long, really good versions of those things, and just be known for a particular thing. I think like in all of this, like differentiation is super important. And so just be known for like real depth, and probably just have it be like paid, small audience, like a bunch of that kind of stuff in the beginning to build a mystique around it. Maybe assuming that like the content is even good enough to do that. I think it is really hard. And I don't know if I could do that now even. So like, I'm not saying this is a guarantee, but I think it'd be like the best bet is if there's a lot of like 2,000 word pretty milquetoast blog posts on tech, then you have to do something different. And I think for me, I'm going to be better in writing than on video probably. And so I'd stick with that, but you'd have to figure out exactly what the right angle is. Maybe you'd start a physical print business to be totally counterintuitive. But now people are like, I would love to do that because some of my pieces are longer, but now people are doing it well. I think Arena Magazine is doing that well. Colossus is doing that really, really well. And so like any good idea, and like, this is another, I'm going to quote a lot of Ben Thompson probably. This is another idea that he had, but I've never actually been able to find the piece, but I'm sure that he wrote it somewhere, which is that like you can see the business model changes that are coming for everything else coming in media, because like essentially you're just like putting some words out there, and so it's like the fastest to adapt of any industry, because it's like pretty easy to produce content in it. And I think you're seeing like just how quickly media can evolve, where I think in a year, if you try to put out a print magazine, it's like clearly somebody else like already owns that move. And it's like not like everyone's going to go back to reading only physical. So the market's not that big. It's like almost a marketing thing for everything else. And so you got to figure out like what the next thing after that is. So I want to go back to something you said at the beginning of our conversation. You mentioned, you always want to be a founder, and I know when you say founder, you're thinking like big tech founder, but you are a founder. You just
founded a different type of business. So how do you think about, you're investing through Not Boring, you're investing in companies that have this tremendous scale. Obviously what you're doing is not that scalable. How do you think about the trade-offs between pursuing like those very different models of entrepreneurship?
I think it really all depends what you want to do and what you're best at. Like maybe it's like an ikigai thing, I don't know, but like what you really like doing, what you're good at, and where I think you can be the most like uniquely add the most value. For me, like, a company I've written about a couple of times is Base Power Company, and like I think it's the coolest thing in the world. Like one of the few companies that I would like just go work for. And like, there's just no way that I start that company. Or, it's like this weekend I was in San Francisco hanging out with Ian at Astromechanica, and they're making supersonic planes. And like, he's been building planes for 18 years, like by himself. Wow. And flying them. And it's just like obsessed with this category. And it's like, just we had a conversation about like how his brain works versus mine. I was like trying to figure out like actually like what he thinks when he's thinking about things. And it's so much like there's just not a chance in hell that I would be able to do what he does. And so I think there's like it's a recognition of like what you can do best versus others. Like this is the category of stuff that I like the most, but probably the biggest contribution that I can have is to get as good at writing as I possibly can, and then apply it to like a smaller and smaller number of companies. And so that's kind of how I think about it, is like, I like this scale for me. I really like working, kind of for myself and being able to like, write about deep tech companies and then like consciousness, I get to do kind of whatever I want. And I really like that style, and I'm comfortable with risk and all of that. So that works, but it's not a decision that I think this is like a better model than going and starting one of those companies. Like clearly if I were better, I probably, at those things, I might go do that. But it's more just like, I really like this as the best way to kind of like apply my skills and interests.
So I love metaphors or analogies. And as you're talking, I'm thinking about like Levi's during the gold rush. How Levi's started during the gold rush, and yep. the family, they didn't sell the picks and the axes as people talk about. They weren't going and mining for gold. They started selling jeans. And so I feel like in some ways you figured out like, what's your version of selling jeans in this ecosystem that isn't you becoming a gold miner or even selling the tools of that?
I think that's 100% right. And I think I lucked into that. That was not the plan originally. I think part of it is like, I feel very lucky that I was able to find a business behind just like this thing that I would want to do anyway. Like I always said that if, I got really rich really young, my retirement would just be writing, investing, and talking to smart people.
So you're living your retirement, which is pretty cool.
So I'm living my retirement.
And you're getting paid to do it.
So, exactly. And so the fact that there's a business there also is great.
That's awesome. So I think that brings it home nicely too. As you think about the broader creator, online game, as I call it, like self-funded ecosystem, what is one future trend or conviction that you are really super excited about that others might be underestimating?
I think probably the thing that I'm like highest conviction with the least specificity on what it actually looks like is that there will be a swing back to figuring out how to like enhance human capabilities. Mm-hmm. And so I think you're seeing like the rise of religion now, or there's, Dan Brown just wrote his new book, and it was all about near-death experiences and consciousness. And like, there's a whole, consciousness is non-local thing happening. And it just like, it's a little bit of tea leaf reading at this point. Like, I don't have a specific version of what it is, but I was literally emailing with an investor that I know this morning who was kind of like, he just read the Dan Brown book, and he's like, I just want like the drug or the like whatever that will like open my brain up the way that like they talk about in the book. And I think that there's going to be a push towards like figuring out, as AI both gets more impressive, but like also falls short on that like uniquely human aspect, like how you enhance that like uniquely human thing. And so maybe like, on the small business side, like I bet we see like different people trying to build like, an equinox of meditation type thing or like different things like that. I bet will happen. And I think you'll see a lot more content about this. So like, I just think that feels like one to me.
That's awesome. Well, Packy, thank you so much. Where can people find you and find out more about Not Boring?
Yeah, so I'm at notboring.co. I got .com, but I haven't done anything with it yet. Or at Packy M on Twitter.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks for listening to Self-Funded. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow the show wherever you're listening so you don't miss what's coming next. I'd also love for you to leave a review and share what you're most excited about on your own self-funded journey. And if you want to go deeper, check out my Substack. You'll find the link below. Until next time, keep carving your own path.